The file begins. The year 2026 began, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a server in a Manhattan courthouse. Pause. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. A digital seal was broken, and the ghosts of Little St. James came flooding back into the world of the living. For Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the man who was once a prince, this was the second wave. The aftershock that proves the earthquake is not over. He had paid the money. He had accepted the exile. He thought he had bought silence. A foolish assumption. The newly unsealed files were not about salacious details. They were worse. They were administrative. Calendars, flight manifests, internal staff emails detailing the procurement of massages. Cold, hard logistics of the enterprise. And Andrew's name, no longer protected by a royal cipher, appeared not as a guest, but as a recurring line item, a fixture. The public perception, already shattered, was now ground into dust. Each new document was another shovel of dirt on a coffin that was supposed to be sealed. The dread was palpable, not just in the halls of Buckingham Palace, but in the quiet farmhouse in Norfolk, where the disgraced Duke was learning the anatomy of his own irrelevance. He was no longer a character in a drama. He was an exhibit in a posthumous audit of Jeffrey Epstein's sins. And the inventory was far from complete. Then came the news that changed the frequency of the scandal. Pause. Virginia Giuffre was dead. In the winter of 2025, the central witness, the accuser-in-chief, the nobody's girl who had shaken one of the world's oldest monarchies, was silenced forever. But death has a strange way of amplifying a voice. Her posthumously published memoir became less a book and more a sacred text. Her accusations, once contested in courtrooms and settled with cash, were now etched into the public consciousness. A bitter testament. The firm had outlived the accuser, but they could not outrun her story. Her death forced a re-examination of everything. The settlement Andrew paid no longer looked like a shrewd legal maneuver. It looked like blood money. The silence from his camp, once a strategy of regal disdain, now felt like the cold quiet of guilt. Each testimony from other victims was now viewed through the lens of Giuffre'S maimed fate. She was the human cost, the face of the collateral damage in a war of privilege and perversion. For Andrew, this was a new kind of prison. He was no longer just a social pariah. He was a man haunted by a ghost he could never confront, a verdict he could never appeal. Her silence was his sentence. Her silence was his sentence. But every sentence has a beginning. To understand the anatomy of this fall, one must rewind the tape. Past the lawsuits, past the private jets, back to the original sin of his creation. He was born the spare, the second son, a backup plan swaddled in ermine and irrelevance. His brother was the heir. Pause. Andrew was the anecdote. This defined him. It fueled him. His naval career was not an act of service. It was an escape. The Falklands War gave him a purpose the palace could not. For a brief, glorious moment, he was not a Windsor. He was Captain Mountbatten-Windsor, call sign H, a hero. The press christened him Randy Andy, a playful rogue. But it was a misdiagnosis. This wasn't playfulness. It was the early tremors of a man who believed the rules were for the people on the ground, not for him, soaring above the cold Atlantic in a Sea King helicopter. The war hero narrative became his armor. It made him bulletproof. It made him brave. And it made him, pause, profoundly reckless. The applause of a grateful nation is a powerful drug. Its withdrawal leaves a man chasing the echo of glory in far more dangerous places. The echo led him here, to the intersection of fading relevance and new money. The Navy was a memory. The war was a story he told at dinner parties. A prince without a portfolio is a man selling his own name. And buyers were circling. The connection was not made in a palace or a boardroom. It was made in the gray area in between. The nexus was a woman. Pause. Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of a disgraced tycoon, fluent in the language of power and its transactional nature. She was the broker, the key that unlocked the door between old world prestige and new world appetites. Jeffrey Epstein did not look like a predator. He looked like the future. He dealt in numbers, in access, in the intoxicating promise of a world without limits. For a man like Andrew, who had spent his life inside a gilded cage, Epstein's world was not a den of iniquity. It was a liberation. It was a place where his title still mattered, but the suffocating protocol did not. Their first meeting wasn't an interview. It was an audition, and both men knew exactly what part they were playing. Epstein saw a royal seal of approval. Andrew saw a reflection of the man he wanted to be, powerful, self-made, and unbound by the judgment of lesser men. The handshake was a contract. Its terms would be paid in flesh. This currency of flesh was managed by Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the network's chief operating officer, the human ledger. Epstein provided the capital and the island fortress. Maxwell provided the inventory and the social camouflage. Their partnership wasn't romance. It was a merger of pathologies. His, a bottomless appetite for the forbidden. Hers, a desperate need to reclaim the status her father's disgrace had incinerated. She collected names like stamps, scientists, politicians, financiers, and one slightly used Duke of York. Pause. Andrew wasn't just a guest in their world. He was the crown jewel of her collection. A walking, talking certificate of legitimacy. Maxwell understood that for men of a certain generation and stature, access is the ultimate aphrodisiac. She didn't just procure girls. She curated experiences, wrapping sordid transactions in the language of high society, intellectual curiosity, and philanthropic endeavor. The dinner parties were the showroom. The private jet was the back office. The real price of admission was silence. Pause. A silence Maxwell enforced with the precision of a surgeon and the loyalty of a cultist. The receipt was cashed. The lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre in New York was not a battle for truth. It was an inventory of sins presented for payment. Andrew's legal team treated it like a hostile takeover bid. First, the motion to dismiss, citing a secret 2009 deal between Epstein and Giuffre, a legal shield bought with a dead man's money. It failed. Then came the procedural evasions. The prince, a man defined by protocol, suddenly became impossible to find. Process servers were met with the stone walls of Balmoral, a ghost in his own castle. The strategy was clear. Delay, deflect, deny. Make the process so expensive, so exhausting, that the claim itself would die of attrition. But the evidence was a ticking clock. Flight logs, phone records, and the ever-present threat of deposition. The crown could not afford to have a prince questioned under oath about his appetites. The final act was not a verdict. It was a settlement, a transaction conducted in the silent language of wealth. The sum, rumored to be in the millions, was never officially disclosed. It was the price of silence, the cost to bury a story that refused to die. This wasn't justice. Pause. It was a very expensive redaction. Redaction bought him quiet. It did not buy him innocence. The court of public opinion remained in a session, and the prince decided to represent himself. The result was the anatomy of a public suicide, broadcast on the BBC. The interview wasn't a defense, it was a confession of detachment. He sat in a gilded room in Buckingham Palace, a man trying to explain a black hole. He offered alibis of pizza and children's parties. Mundane details meant to overwrite mortal sins. He spoke of a peculiar medical condition, an inability to sweat, as if biology could provide an alibi for morality. Each answer was a shovel of dirt on his own reputation. It was the voice of a man who had never been told no, a man for whom consequence was a foreign concept. He did not seem to be lying. He seemed simply unable to comprehend the reality of the accusations. The fallout was immediate, absolute. The firm, the ancient machinery of the monarchy, moved to contain the damage. Patronages were stripped. Duties were revoked. It was a clinical amputation. His title of His Royal Highness was put into storage, a relic of a former life. He was not imprisoned. He was erased, placed in a gilded cage of internal exile, a living ghost haunting the corridors of Windsor. His public life was over. The verdict had been delivered not by a judge, but by an audience that could no longer suspend its disbelief. Pause. The prince was dead. Only the man remained. And the man required housing. The institution, in a final act of administrative cruelty, began the inventory of his life. The eviction notice for Royal Lodge arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of official stationery. For 22 years, this sprawling mansion was his stage set, secured for a pittance. A one-time payment of £7.5 million for repairs in exchange for a lease whose rent was a single peppercorn, a deal smelling of divine right. Now the new king, his own brother, was changing the locks. The decision was not familial. It was corporate sanitation. Andrew was a non-performing asset, a reputational liability being written off the books. His next destination was a 5-bedroom farmhouse, a place described with clinical disdain. Pause. Marsh Farm, a name that tastes of damp earth and mediocrity. He visited the property to assess the future. He was reportedly displeased. The man who once entertained financiers in palaces now had to worry about security upgrades and rumors of pests. This was the true exile. Not the loss of a title, but the loss of insulation from the mundane, ugly realities of the world. A gilded cage exchanged for a merely functional one. The exile was physical, but the prison was digital. As he retreated into the Norfolk countryside, the archives of his sins were unsealed for the world. A new dump of Epstein's files. The anatomy of the correspondence was damning. Emails discussing a 26-year-old Russian woman. An invitation for a convicted predator to dine inside the palace walls. Then came the photographs. A grainy image of a man resembling Andrew, kneeling over a woman on the floor. The context was irrelevant. The image was a tattoo on the public consciousness. And then the final verdict, delivered from beyond the grave. Virginia Giuffre'S memoir, Nobody's Girl. It was not a book. It was a posthumous audit of his soul. Her words described orgies with girls who didn't speak the language. They described him hiding in Balmoral to dodge court papers. The firm could strip his titles and move his furniture, but it could not erase the cloud. The damage was not to a man. It was to the crown itself. A permanent crack in the porcelain facade. A lingering question of what they knew and when they silenced it. His isolation is now absolute, a ghost on horseback, haunting the royal estates. Pause. The legacy is not one of scandal, but of a mirror held up to an entire system, revealing the rot beneath the gold.